I'm Marcus. I'm from Building Beats, and we're a nonprofit organization based here in New York City. We provide music and podcasting education to youth in New York and also Los Angeles as of last year. So this is the first workshop in a series as part of New York Music Month, the Art of Podcasting. Extended Play, it's an initiative of the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, and we will be offering a number of workshops on music production and podcasting starting today through May. So I added the link in the chat, but I'll add it again in case you want to continue learning about the different workshops we'll be providing. So today is Podcasting 101, and during this workshop, we're going to be learning all the basics of podcasting, touching upon gear, software, podcast length, different types of podcasts, everything that you would think about when starting a podcast. And we've got one of our workshop leaders, a professional podcast producer, Nina Pollock. And Nina is based also here in New York. And she's a composer, creative audio engineer, and podcast producer. She knows how to do it all. Nina, if you wanted to hop in and add anything to it. Thank you so much for doing this, Nina.
No problem. Thank you for the kind introduction. That was like the most New York City intro on Zoom I've ever heard. But thank you for the kind intro. Thank you guys for being here. Hope everyone's healthy, safe, feeling good. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm just going to go through Podcasting 101. Marcus pretty much laid it out. Just go through some different podcast formats, some of the gear. Feel free to just jump in and ask questions at any point. I think Marcus will be able to answer some questions in the chat. But also if you want to just unmute and ask, I don't mind at all because I'll be presenting, so I won't really be able to see anyone. So I'm just going to keep talking. So it might be nice to get interrupted once in a while. But then we'll probably have some time at the end for you guys to ask any questions you might have as well. So I'll just share my screen. And I'll do the classic, can you see my screen? Let's see, I'll get it in presenter mode. Okay, how's that? Good to go? Cool? Okay, awesome. Cool. All right, Podcasting 101, already covered that. My name is Nina Pollock. This is just one of my favorite podcasting memes I felt like I had to share with everyone. It kind of feels like this is what is going on at iTunes every single week. As I'm sure everyone's realized, podcasts are just, the industry is just building and growing and growing and growing, which is awesome. So it's really cool you guys have an interest in podcasting because it really is an evolving medium, and it's a lot of fun. And I'll go a little bit into my background. So I went to the Academy of Art University. I actually studied film scoring. So I have more of a music composing background, and then kind of just stumbled into a podcast production just because I learned some of the sound editing engineering techniques in school. And this was sort of when podcasting was getting really popular again. I think this was around like when Serial came out. Not sure if you guys know that one, but it was a pretty big podcast a few years ago that really launched the industry forward very, very greatly. And so I kind of stumbled into this industry, and I was like, all right, I know how to edit sound and mix a little bit, so let's just do it. Apparently people like podcasting, so let's go. And so years later, here I am still doing it and loving it, and thankfully it's a growing industry. So then I got my first official podcast gigs at Podfly Productions. They produce just a variety of weekly podcasts, some branded podcasts. I'll go through like the difference of those as well further into the presentation. And then I do some freelance production too. That's kind of standard as well. It's like a lot of freelancers in the podcasting world, a lot of audio engineers, similar with like radio background, music background, anything like that, media background. The nice thing is podcasting has quite a variety of like people with audio backgrounds, with journalist backgrounds, writing backgrounds, just speaking backgrounds. So a lot of talented people in a variety of different areas collaborating together. So it's a very collaborative industry, which is why I love it as well. And then I also actually work part-time at Bloomberg as well, doing some audio video editing. And then of course the wonderful Building Beats. I did some assistant teaching a little bit last year before quarantine, and it's just wonderful to work with them. So I really appreciate them having me here today to do Podcasting 101. So this is a few of the shows that I work on. Um, just to kind of show the range. So the Saturday Night Stories one, I actually just completed that recently for UCSF, and that was a storytelling show that I worked on, which was a lot of fun, and it was like incorporated a lot of music and sound effects. Some of these other shows are just pretty basic interview shows. I'm sure you've heard a variety of these shows as well. There are so many different formats now, and everyone's being really creative with how they're producing podcasts, and it's like an ever evolving medium, like I said. So some of these are pretty basic, you'd say, interview podcasts. Some are just single host podcast. Connection, the Ring Central one, they kind of are a mix as well. They had some storytelling, some narrative, and then some interviews as well. So it's cool because it's a very experimental industry as well, and that's kind of the big theme, I think, of today. Is podcasting is pretty much what you make it, which is why it's great. It's why I love the podcasting world as well, because if you have something that you're really passionate about talking about, that's pretty much it. You could get some gear, you can start talking about it, record yourself, and you're good to go. It does take a little bit more effort than that, but really that's the most important thing, is having something you're passionate to talk about, either with yourself or with other people. And that's pretty much it. And you can put it out there, and it's really accessible too, which is another reason I love it. It's just anybody can talk about anything that they want. And some people complain because people say it's a bit saturated now, but I think the more the merrier. And it's great that we have such a wide variety of voices out there sharing stories that are important to them. So these are a few of the stories that I've been working on. So the first thing, besides, of course, figuring out what you want to talk about, um, which again can be kind of tricky. I've had a few people come up to me and just say, I want to start a podcast, but I don't know what I want it to be about. Well, you definitely want to know what it's going to be about before you jump into it. That's the most important thing. I've had a few people who have um, you wanted to start interview shows, but sometimes that actually the content can run out kind of quickly. Um, the nice thing now is it's almost like television, where there are a lot of like mini series of podcasts or like short seasons that have a few episodes. So the nice thing too is like, okay, if you want to have a podcast that only has 5 episodes, you can totally do that, and that's fine. So something I also like to tell people is it's fine if you don't want your podcast to go on for 5 years, even though it's like Joe Rogan has had like 1,000 episodes, I think, in his time, but you don't have to do that, which is great. So again, you decide what you want to do with podcasting. Um, so how do you sound so good? So the nice thing as well about podcasting is that the gear is you can get some pretty solid, affordable mics nowadays. Really great USB microphones. There are 2 listed here. The ATR 2100 and the Samson Q2U are 2 of my favorites that I usually recommend my clients get if they're just starting out. And yeah, the range is usually like 100 to 150, which is a great setup. I mean, it's like, of course, back in the day, you would have to go to a studio and record everything. It was like recording at home was not even an option. And now you can record at home. You can even record on an iPad. Like I've had some people even record on their phone, which isn't the best quality, of course, but just a nice solid microphone and a computer is pretty much all you need at the end of the day, which is great. And we're also going to put some of these resources as well, send these out to you so you know exactly what mic, if you're interested and can research it a little bit more. But yeah, USB mics are great. It's a great way to start. You can upgrade a little bit too down the road, but you would be pretty amazed at the quality you could get from some of these pretty straightforward USB mics, which is awesome. And then, of course, some of the other basics, like a desktop stand, is important. It's one of those things that you forget you need, and then you have your mic, and then you don't know where to put it. Or oftentimes, this is just a very annoying details that a lot of microphones come with really bad stands. I don't know why, it's like a thing. So I always recommend, just a thing to note, get a separate desktop stand. I can make sure to add that as well too, the stand I recommend. And then a pop filter is also very, very, very important when recording. So the pop filters, and you can kind of see in this photo, it's the silver thing in front of the mic. Essentially what it does is a lot of the times when you're speaking directly in front of the microphone, it'll kind of create what we call plosives. So it's like any of the P's or the T's or a lot of breath can come through. And especially on high quality mics, The pro is obviously that the quality is great and you sound fantastic, but the con is that if you don't have a pop filter, it's going to pick up everything. And then sometimes it picks up those really strong P's and a lot of the breaths and all that stuff that you don't want. So the magic of a pop filter is pretty incredible. Definitely a standard. Again, it's nice. It's not something that's too expensive, but very, very important just to make sure you sound as good as possible. And then, believe it or not, you need a computer as well. And you can record on a ton of different softwares, which is great. It's kind of like dealer's choice. Pros and cons to, I think, every single software to record on, as long as it has a record button. I say that's great. A lot of people like to record on Zoom. One note I think that's important to make is if you're doing interviews or if you're recording, like if say I were recording this workshop and we were recording everyone on the call, the one important thing is to make sure that you're recording as separate tracks. This just saves you, if you're editing, or the editor, whoever's taking on that role. It's so much easier to edit separate tracks in case like someone's breathing while the other person is talking, or they sneeze, or people talk over each other. It's kind of a amazing to like. I wish I should do this actually at some point, just sort of show like the before and after, because you'd be surprised how many podcasts, how many conversations are manipulated to sound like they, of course, flow nicer. And that's even like, of course, the basics of removing ums and ahs and lip smacks and all that stuff, but even talking over each other. I've even switched around a few sentences here and there, or I just think the sentence should definitely go like a few seconds before the other one. Remove sentences a lot. There's a lot of variation, so you would be surprised how often they're manipulated. But again, that's just an important detail if you're going to take on the editing role, especially that recording separate tracks is very, very important. And yeah, so a lot of the recording software like Zoom is great, GarageBand. If you're a Mac user, that's pretty standard. Squadcast and Zencaster are actually specific podcasting sites where you can record, and that's nice for bigger groups. So Zoom is good too, of course, and everyone's used to Zoom now, so it actually, a lot of people just feel more comfortable with it because we've been forced to use it for the last year. And it records totally fine. But the nice thing about like something like Squadcast or Zencaster is that it's meant for podcast recording. So they actually, the audio will actually be even a touch better. And the nice thing too is they'll, like if you're doing an interview show, and Zoom can be a little tricky in terms of recording and organizing your files. So it seems like a small detail, but the organization aspect of these platforms is really, really great. So you set up an interview with someone, you send them a link, record that interview, and it's stored there pretty much forever until you delete it, which sounds minor, but it's not. It's actually so great, and just makes the process so much easier. Even in terms of just interviewing people, just being able to send an easy, quick invite. A lot of these, things seem minor, but it just makes the process a whole lot easier, and the less you have to worry about, the better, I always say. So that's why I definitely would recommend something like Squadcast or Zencaster. Usually those are monthly subscriptions as well. So I'm trying to remember the exact amount, but usually it's anywhere between like $15, $20 a month. So that's the other thing too. If you're on a budget, usually like Zoom could work, or even recording on GarageBand, depending, of course, on if it's an interview or not. But I just definitely think, yeah, Squadcast and Zencaster are pretty great and worth investing in if you're going to be a podcaster. But the nice thing is there are plenty of options out there, and options are arising almost every single day now. So Squadcast and Zencaster are two of like probably 50 podcasting recording softwares and sites. So that's nice. There's no shortage, which is great. And again, yeah, if anyone has any questions or if I've said anything that makes no sense or want to know more specifics about any of this, please feel free to chime in. But that's pretty much the basic. Those are the basic pieces of gear that you need. Thankfully, nowadays, podcasting is pretty affordable, and it's an approachable medium, which is great. So you don't need too much to get set up, and you can do it right in the comfort of your home, even though I'm sure you all want to get out of your homes at this point. But who knows? Now we're kind of all into it, so we might as well lean in. All right. So I'll go a little bit into podcast structures. These are pretty pretty broad. I mean, there's a lot of variation. A lot of these are combined too, which is kind of fun. So I was talking about the Ring Central show before. That has a little bit of nonfiction storytelling as well as interviews. So the cool thing too is that you can kind of make it whatever you want. So I think it's really great to learn these structures, understand the format, how people use them, what works, what doesn't work, and then kind of experiment as well. I think that's totally fine, and an important thing to do with podcasting, because I'll go into it a little bit later, but your audience's feedback is really, really important. And you just want to always be aware of what's working, what's not working. And again, like, it's your podcast. So you do whatever you want with it. If you want to change the format, 5 episodes in, you can do that, and it's totally fine. Nothing to be afraid of. But here are some of the main structures. So, of course, number one, pretty standard, the interview. Usually that's one host, one interviewee. That would be recorded on something like Squadcast or Zencaster, in person, maybe in a few months. Who knows? Then the panel, that's sort of, I kind of think like a round table as well. So that's maybe having a few guests, maybe talking about one specific topic. The interview too is usually those podcasts you'll find, of course, it's like the podcast is based on one topic, and they'll find maybe professionals in the industry, or people, maybe even some people interview. I would say having a topic is really important. I think one thing I try to stray people away from is losing the, I guess I would say, the mission. I think it's important to have a mission of your podcast. Something that I see when podcasts sort of decline is when they kind of lose the intention. They forget really what their mission is, what they even want to talk about. And again, like I said in the beginning, the interview can be a little tough too, because if I've seen some people run out of guests to interview. So that's why it's good to also experiment a little bit as well. Because you might you might really just like not have enough people to interview, and that can be kind of a tricky thing to run into. So you want to just always have your mission in mind, but also the flexibility, which is kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but you want to be focused, but also have that freedom to kind of branch out and maybe change. So maybe if you've had a topic and you've had a lot of people to interview for a while, but then you've run out of people that can come on your show, you kind of have to be creative. And I've had some people that have not wanted to do solo podcasts, but they've had to lean in that direction because they haven't had anyone to interview. And so it's important to get comfortable with that if you want to continue your podcast, of course. Again, if you don't want to continue your podcast, that's fine too. No one's pressured you to do that. So anyway, next is the solo. Pretty standard. Solo, I think, is probably the hardest podcasting structure because you really have to have a lot to talk about. So essentially, like, what I've put together today is what someone would have to do for every single show. So it actually really is a lot. It's easier said than done to say you could talk about something for an hour or so, but really it's actually quite difficult. And a lot of people end up writing scripts actually for their solo podcast, which I remember being kind of shocked by in the beginning. I thought anyone with a solo podcast was just really brilliant on their own and had a lot of great ideas and could just go off the cuff. And I thought that was really cool. And some people definitely can. And you kind of have to have that as well, just the natural ability to speak about something that you're passionate about and just kind of go off tangents and still be engaging. But a lot of people have written out complete scripts. So that's just something to keep in mind too. Just, you always want to be aware of how much work you're going to have ahead of you. And that's something, again, you can control, but just make sure to understand these structures and what they entail before diving in. Because if you want to start a solo podcast and you're like episode 3, you're like, I have no idea what to talk about. This is taking way too long. I can't do it anymore. Some people run into that situation. And the next is conversational. So this is a little bit different than the interview. This is more conversational, if that wasn't self-explanatory enough. But this is usually like 2 co-hosts. I would say maybe like making or no, I'm forgetting the podcast about the crime podcast, but this is 2 women that basically just talk about just different crimes in history and kind of diving into it. So more shows like that, where again, that's a great show because they have that main theme, mission, if you will, and there's a lot of variety as well. So sadly, there's no shortage of that type of content. I wish there was, but there isn't. So there's always going to be these new cases to talk about and dive into. But it's a more casual conversation between the two co-hosts. It's not an intense interview. You don't have to really come up with too many questions, but it's more of diving into a topic. And then that also kind of bleeds into nonfiction storytelling. So that's what I was saying, like some of these are combined as well. And again, like the interview also in a sense can become nonfiction storytelling too. And so nonfiction storytelling can be, some of them are very structured, some of them are not. Some, like I would say shows like the crime shows that dive into different stories like that technically is nonfiction storytelling. And there's a variety in terms of how much production is put into it. So some shows just have their hosts. They might have a little bit of music in the beginning. They have a music in the middle for transitions every now and again. Some shows really go deep into sound effects and creating a scene, and even have composers scoring the entire show. And so that's sort of a new level, and that's a lot of fun. Those are the shows I love working on because I love putting sound effects and music together. But that's something else to think about, because in your mind you might really say to yourself, oh, I really want a show with a lot of music and a lot of sound effects, and I want to tell a story and set the scene. And but it is a lot of work because it's a lot of post-production, and you have to again do the scripting and everything. But definitely just worth exploring, and I'll put in some podcasts I recommend listening to as well for each of these. Might be helpful to just at least have an ear and take a listen, and kind of see what might fit best if you're interested in starting your own podcast. But next we have fictional storytelling, which is usually going to be the standard. That's more so, it's basically like a TV show or a film, a lot of sound effects, a lot of music, and that gets into more of the creative side of podcasting. Again, pretty self-explanatory, just fictional stories. And then the last one is repurposed content. This is something that I've actually found pretty helpful for a lot of people, like a lot of businesses actually, or folks that have webinars or anything like that. A lot of people that have been interested in starting a podcast will actually just use some of that content, and they'll transfer it over, repurpose it, and turn it into a podcast, which I think is really great. It's even great for, like I was saying, if you might run out of content, if your podcast is based on maybe your business or anything like that, and you have this extra content, it's a great thing to push out and share with your audience, especially in those times where you might not have an interview or you don't have anything to say solo as well. And another reason that's important, which I think I might get into the next slide, is consistency of releasing a podcast. Or I don't think I go into that yet, but I'll comment on that right now really quickly before I forget, because you might be thinking like, okay, well, why would I put out repurposed content if I don't have an interview, if I don't have anything to say solo? Then I might as well just not say anything at all, right? But it's actually found that consistency is pretty much key to podcasting and keeping your audience engagement. It's not really so much frequency actually, but more so consistency. So I've even had monthly shows with way more engagement than weekly shows that end up actually varying. Like they'll be live 1 week and then they'll take 3 weeks off, and the audience won't really know when to expect them back. And that's kind of the whole idea. You want to create this relationship with your audience where they know, okay, every Tuesday, I know I'm going to wake up, do the dishes. We used to go to work, so go to work, listen to a podcast, and you know that you can expect that. And it seems like a little thing, but it's actually very, very important. And a lot of podcasters will lose their audience because the lack of consistency in not uploading or publishing content when they're supposed to, if you will.
Nina, there's a question, I think from the last slide. If you had to rank in terms of how heavy the lift is to create, would these be in the same order? I realized certain creative decisions would influence.
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, let's see if I can go back. Perfect. Okay. No, it would not be in the same order. I would say then in that case, repurposed content, the easiest to do for sure. Then I would say maybe the interview and the panel are probably around the same. The solo, I would actually say, is harder than even, the conversational, the co-host. I would put the solo pretty down on the list or high on the list because it just takes a lot of work for someone to, again, like I said, script their podcast and just talk for like 30 minutes or so. And then I would say anything with music and sound effects, of course, that lift is going to be pretty heavy because you're also, depending on what you're comfortable with, you might be the one to edit and engineer and do the sound effects and music. You might also need to end up outsourcing or hiring someone to do that as well. And that's something too, is just understanding, like that gets into time commitments and understanding your flexibility and then just quality as well. Sometimes I've had people who've tried to do like the music sound effects and they just know it's not their thing. And they're like, I'm not even good at this. It's taking too much time. And they might as well just hire someone to help. So that's an option as well. And there are plenty of producers and engineers out there, which is great. So it really is a wonderful community and you can find someone to help you out. Even if it's like, if you don't want to hire someone for every episode, but you want someone to teach you how to maybe incorporate music and sound effects more, that's always going to be available, which is great. But yeah, I would say anything with the music, sound effects, probably the heaviest lift, most post-production, but I would say live content, probably the solo is probably the hardest in terms of pressing record and figuring out what you're going to say.
Nina, can you give an example of what repurposed content would be?
Yes. Yeah. So this would be like, I would say webinars. I've had a couple clients who hosted webinars or even something like this, like a Zoom meeting or anything that is related to your podcast. So usually it's something that it's usually something brands or companies will do. It's less of something like someone who's has a solo podcast and just sort of talking about whatever they're interested in, just because they might not have as much content to kind of move around. But a lot of companies end up having meetings that they record, workshops that they record, and it's stuff like that as long as it's audio, you can easily turn that into a podcast or even just like cut it down to 30 minutes and upload that. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. And then also actually one more thing to add. A lot of people will if they have enough episodes in their backlog, re-uploading and reposting is actually a great thing to do too. So I actually recommend that as well. I'd say instead of going completely dry one week, just upload a podcast that you released even just a few months ago or like a year ago, depending, of course, how long you've been podcasting. And I just think that's a great way to engage listeners that maybe weren't along for the ride at that stage, which is great because maybe they haven't gone back to hear that podcast. And again, it's like those little, it's a lot of psychology too, because it's almost like reminding your audience of, hey, I'm still here. I still have a podcast. You might have heard this interview already, but maybe take a listen again or just don't forget me. So repurposed content can also be past podcast episodes too, which is of course the easiest to do as well. So can be very convenient sometimes, but hopefully that answered that question.
Nina, how do you find your paid podcast work?
Oh, how do I find the work? So through Podfly Productions, I find a lot of work through them because they're kind of it's basically a lot of freelancers and independent contractors work for that company, and basically they'll get a call, hey, I want to start a weekly podcast, and I'm one of the engineers that might get offered a podcast once in a while of, hey, we have this new client that's interested, would you take this on? So the tricky thing, of course, about the freelance life is it's never a given. So it's not like, okay, I know for a fact I'm going to get, a certain amount of podcasts this month versus next month. You have no idea, but it is nice to be connected to a company like that. And then freelance as well too. There are some freelance websites that I've gotten some work from. And then also it's a really great community and actually a pretty small community as well, even though there are a lot of podcasts out there. I've gotten some work just word of mouth or friends that are also engineers that couldn't take on the work, didn't have the bandwidth, but I'm an engineer friend. They said, hey, do you have the time? So it's a great community to get into for that reason as well, because you could just find a lot of different projects to work on at different times. So kind of a variety, I guess. Okay, so I think this was next. This is just another podcast meme. There are a few podcast memes just to prepare you. I had to take full advantage. Oh wait, there we go. Okay, so engagement. This is basically going to be the next 2 slides. Tone is everything. It's, again, this is really sort of the kind of similar to what I was saying in the last slide about consistency in terms of releasing. Well, consistency with tone is also very important. So it's a little bit annoying because you'll probably hear me throughout this talk too kind of say a lot of contradictions, because it is this, you have to find this balance of keeping a tone and keeping an overall vibe, if you will, of your show, but also keep it fresh and interesting. And that can be tricky to do, but I find there are a few easy, simple, straightforward ways to do that. But yeah, at the top when I talk about narrative, so it's, and even if it's an interview show, this is similar to like the mission I was talking about. You just want to keep a consistent theme almost, and also a reason as to why anyone should listen to you. So that's kind of like a harsh question you have to ask yourself in the beginning is, am I saying anything important? Will anyone care? Does anyone need to care? Because also they might not need to care, which is totally fine. But what I'm saying interesting? How can I make it fresh? Can I really talk about this for X amount of episodes? And then music and sound effects is another really easy way to maintain a tone, or even solidify your tone with your podcast. That can be just your intro music and your outro music. I'm sure there are plenty of podcasts you guys know, and you can probably hear the music right now in your mind, and that sets the tone as well for the style. And sound effects is another great way to just kind of, and again, that can't really be incorporated into every podcast. An interview show, depending on how they're structuring it and the story that they're telling, it might not call for sound effects or not, but music is just a great way, even through transitions, is a great way to sort of set the tone and keep it fresh as well. Even just, I'll recommend, like, even if it's a 30-minute interview, to break every 10 minutes, even if it's just a 3-5 second musical transition. I find anything that pulls the listener out is actually quite helpful. Sometimes people need to be snapped out of it for a second to then be re-engaged in the podcast. So I find simple things like musical transitions can be really helpful. And then the structure and the language and everything, it's just, people are going to come to your show from the get-go, either really interested in the topic or really interested in you, in the way that you're sharing your ideas or expressing your ideas. So I think it's important to kind of maintain consistency with that as well. And I talk about teasing as well, because that's just a really great tool to keep people interested in coming back for more. So I always suggest, when structuring your podcast releases, definitely know, I would say at least like 4 or 5 episodes, have them backlogged, and be able to tease your future episodes and your present episodes. That's just a really quick and easy way to get people interested in coming back for more. And even at the top of the episode, if it's an interview, another great tool that I suggest people use is pulling a clip from the interview, maybe the middle of the interview, that's interesting or funny or catchy, and putting it at the top so people sort of know what to expect. Because I think that's important as well, like finding that balance of making it really clear what you're going to learn in this podcast. There's so many podcasts out there now. I don't really know how people are listening to so many of them, but there really are just a ton. And that's great, but it also makes it really easy for people to stop listening to yours and move on to the next one. So you just sort of want to keep reminding them of why it's important that they listen to yours, why, and again, you don't want to force people to listen to your podcast, but why it's interesting, what you're saying is important to hear, and that, why they want to be a part of your community, because really that's what you want to create with your podcast, is a community. And that's, I think, why podcasting is so great, because you really can create a nice bond with your audience, and create really great relationships and community around whatever you're talking about. But yeah, again, consistency I think is really key, and then of course keeping it fresh, which again is like the contradiction um, I'm saying, because you want to be consistent with a little bit of flexibility, um, because you don't want it to be just exactly the same every single week, or people will get really bored. But you don't want to stray too far away where people are like, this is not what I signed up for in the beginning. So it's finding that happy medium. Um, and it is definitely possible and takes some experimentation. But intro outro is a very simple, straightforward way to keep it fresh. Usually, if it's an interview show, I suggest before the interview having a pretty quick intro outro, or pretty quick intro in the beginning. I say to get into details like no more than 5 minutes. Some intros I've heard are very long, like 15, 20 minutes. I don't think that's really necessary. I think you don't want to make your audience wait for too long. But I do think building a relationship with your audience is very important. And usually that's done in those first 5 minutes. So I've had a few people pretty much just producing interview shows, which is great. And it is really fantastic content. But the audience doesn't really know who their host is very well. So I think the intro outro is a great way to connect with the host, since you're going to be the consistent piece of that podcast throughout the entire series. So it's just important that they get to know you. They're going to probably want to come back because of you, because if you think about it, think about how many podcasts are out there that cover the same exact topic, which is totally fine. There are only so many topics, but you really come back because you like the host and you like their ideas or the way they're expressing them. So just remember that it's important to connect with them and also listen to your audience too. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I think the communication piece is pretty important and a cool aspect of podcasting too. Alternating segments is another suggestion. I'll usually give some clients that are maybe, like I was saying in the beginning, maybe they don't have a lot of people to interview left on their for their topic. Creating segments is just a fun, interesting way to keep it fresh, and it's very straightforward. But for some reason, people really like the idea of structured segments in podcasts. I personally feel this way as well. There's something about it. Even being named something is actually very helpful. So I've had people have like even just like Q&As or anything like that. Anything that is recurring too is great. So if you know, like, oh, cool, you know, on this week's episode they're going to have this one segment, and I love hearing this, where it's like, I'm forgetting all the segments I've ever added in podcasts, but there's a variety of them. But yeah, Q&As are one, and just anything that relates to your topic. And it doesn't have to be super long. It can be 2 minutes, but there is something about the structure of that is really appealing to listeners. And changing the segment, even that, for some reason, is really pleasing to listeners. We can only listen to an interview for so long. So even having a segment in the middle is actually very helpful. People have found that, like I said before, almost kind of like jolts the listener and they get re-intrigued by the show, like re-engaged, which is really important. And segments are a great way to do that. And then old ideas presented in a new way. Yeah, that's something to keep in mind. As I said before, a lot of podcasts actually have the same topic, but you'll notice that hosts are presenting it in a new and different way. Or you just like the vibe of that host as well. It can be as simple as that. They're just funny, or they have really interesting information that they're sharing. But to kind of find creative ways to express your thoughts is something to pay attention to, because you can really only talk about something for so long, and we tend to, of course, repeat a lot of what other people say. And so finding a new and interesting way to do that is really important as well. And it kind of has to be, it can be a humbling experience as well. Because again, you have to remind yourself, okay, what's the value in what I'm saying versus how this person says it. And so it's just an important thing to keep in mind. Am I sharing anything new? Am I sharing anything interesting? Because really time is valuable, and these people are tuning into your show. So it's important to remind yourself that, in a sense, the podcast is for you, but it's also really for your listeners. So you owe it to them to be creative with the ways in which you're either sharing your ideas or even interviews. And one of the next workshops is actually going to be on interviewing, which is a whole other skill set than producing or editing or anything like that. And interviewing is really important. Finding interesting ways to even frame the same question. It really is an art form. But paying attention to that is definitely key. All right, so I think that's it on engagement number 1. Engagement continued. I'm talking so fast, I'm losing my breath. I'll try to slow down. So I just love this quote, and I think this is perfect for podcasting. It's sort of why I brought up the formats earlier. It's important to understand those formats, why some of them work, why some of them don't work, and then pretty much do whatever you want, and hopefully that works. And again, like, I think engaging with your audience is so key. So that's number 2 on this page, which is just get in touch with your audience. What do they want to hear? And that's as simple as just asking them. So I suggest a lot of podcasters really enforce, hey, get in touch with us at this email or on our Instagram or Facebook or anything like that. Because again, like I just said, the podcast is for you, but it also really is for your listeners. And you want them to know that you're thinking about them, which sounds kind of funny, but it really changes how engaged they'll be, how willing they'll be to keep listening. And I think Q&As are really great for that as well. The excitement that listeners have when they hear their question being read on a podcast is very intense. And so taking advantage of that is great. Creating a community where other people can talk about your show too is really cool. So depends on your topic, of course, but I think that's just another reason podcasting is a fantastic medium, because you can talk about whatever you want, and guarantee there are going to be people out there that are into it. And it could be something that they can't find elsewhere. I actually work on a sex addiction podcast, which has been really impactful to work on and hear. And this community that I've seen build around this has been pretty fantastic, and really important to a lot of people and a lot of listeners, creating a safe place for them. And so it can be something serious like that, or it can be something else like music or video games or movies or anything super niche. But allowing your listeners, or giving them the opportunity to connect with each other and then also connect with you is definitely key. And Patreon is a win-win for that. So Patreon is fantastic for podcasters. This is where I suggest a lot of podcasters release maybe a bonus content, anything like that. And this is where they can, of course, donate and support your podcast financially, which can be great. Again, it's another fantastic way to build a community and have that back and forth support emotionally and financially, which is all great. And again, having that bonus content, it's like that psychological thing where it makes the members feel very special, of course, and they feel listened to. And that is just super key. So you just want to keep that in mind. Even giving your listeners like a 5-minute bonus, like behind the scenes, or even blooper reels I've put together for some people, which is a lot of fun, stuff like that. Doesn't have to take a lot of effort, doesn't even have to be super long, but anything a little special for your audience, I think, makes a big difference and goes a long way. Because as I said before, there are hundreds of podcasts out there. It's really easy to listen to a podcast for 5 minutes, get bored, and never listen to it again. So you just have to find creative ways to keep people engaged. And of course, you want to be as authentic and genuine as possible. You don't want to force people to listen to your podcast. But if you do want to create that community, these are just the ways to go about it. And yeah, my first topic, my first point, which I didn't really go over, is pretty much the amount of time you should be podcasting. So I usually say 30, 40 minutes, especially nowadays with the amount of podcasts that are out there. There are a lot of interview shows, especially that are like an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And again, unless you're Joe Rogan or Dax Shepard, it's super hard to have people listen to that for over an hour and a half. I think 30, 40 minutes is a sweet spot. Um, Again, there's a ton of variation on that, but um, I've even had listened to 15-minute interviews that are actually have been much better than hour-long interviews. So it's really quality over quantity. That's another good thing to remember. Don't feel like you need to go on for so long just because in your mind you think a podcast should be an hour. Definitely not. Definitely lean more towards I think like 20, even 20 to 40 minutes, which is still quite a range. But that's in my experience, just what I've seen succeed. Um, and then it takes the pressure off of you to have to come up with content for an hour. So don't put too much pressure on yourself as though that's a standard or anything like that. Again, you make it what you want to. So if you want to have a 10-minute podcast, none of that is a measure of how successful it will be. Again, just depends on what you're talking about too. If you want to go for an hour, there's no problem with that either. But just don't feel the pressure that makes all the difference in the world. And then get in touch with your audience, and then create a familiar yet experimental structure. So this is sort of what I was talking about with the segments and keeping it fresh but also consistent, which is unfortunately a little trial by error. And that's why it's all of this combined is really important. So like I usually suggest if clients are starting a new segment in their podcast, that they then ask their audience, did you like this segment? And sometimes I've had people tell me that their audience really hated a segment they were doing for a few months, and then they just stopped doing that, which was perfect. So it's just really important to keep it fresh, and a lot of trial and error and experimentation and listening to your audience, and reminding them of why they started listening in the first place, why they should continue listening. And again, never forget your mission, which is really important. Why did you create this podcast? Why is it important to you? Why should it be important to other people? That's everything that you really need to keep in mind throughout. And again, sort of like the timing and the first point with the length of your podcast, like I sort of touched on this in the beginning. I think it's great that I've seen a lot of almost like mini series pop up, 8-episode podcast series, which I think is awesome. And I think that's definitely something that will be, it's of course, just easier to navigate and approach and organize as well. And I don't think there's no pressure again to have your podcast go on for years and years. I think if you're able to create there's so many shows that I think should not have gone on for as many seasons as they did, and it's similar with podcasting too. So there's no pressure to say, okay, I'm going to start this podcast. How am I going to keep this going for years and years? Well, you really don't have to. If you want it to end after 8 episodes, if you want it to end after 50 episodes, I think as soon as you feel yourself unable to discuss what you wanted to discuss from the get-go, it's kind of as simple as that, then I think you're good to go. And again, there's no pressure either way, but definitely don't feel like you have to just go on and on. And don't forget why you started it in the first place. All right, let's see. And what's up next? So this is just that was the end of my presentation. This is all the future presentations and workshops from Building Beats. So like I said, you'll get into the art of interviewing, which really is an intense skill and something that's really fascinating to learn about as well, because you don't realize how difficult it is, but also how fun it is, because you really can shape an interview so particularly more than you would think. And then getting good tape, of course, recording 101, getting good tape, editing tape, that's a whole journey in of itself as well. A lot of times I've recorded, or I've had like hour-long episodes that I've had to chop down to 20 minutes. You'll kind of learn how to do that a little bit, and what's valuable, what's not. And of course, how to mix, how to make it sound good. Again, reach your audience, kind of touched on that a little bit today. And how to podcast make money. Another great thing to understand. That's a tricky one to navigate, but there are really awesome creative opportunities now for podcasters to actually make a profit, which is great. And like I said, Patreon is another piece of that too, which I think is a great way to start as well. And then a press kit, of course, and then get it sponsored. And yeah, there's a lot to learn about podcasting, and it's ever evolving and growing a ton. And a lot of this too is, I mean, radio, of course, has been around for so long, and podcasts have even been around for a really long time. But I think they just made an intense comeback within the last like 5-10 years. And so it's growing tremendously, but a lot of people are still trying to figure this out as they go. So that's what I've found in this industry as well. As there's not a perfect way to do any of this, but there are some really cool tips and tricks to make it easier for yourself. And then, of course, you just kind of have to go with the flow, and yeah, hopefully just have fun.
Well,
So
Nina, we have a question real quick. I know like a lot of the topics that are up next for these workshops we'll go also more deeper on the end, but question on the equipment, do you need headphones or a mixer?
yeah, I would say, I mean, headphones for sure. That's, yeah, I should have added that. That's definitely standard just in terms of like feedback as well. That's one of the things that's kind of easy to forget, actually, especially since I forgot it. But it's really important in terms of interviewing. You just don't want to get any feedback. And yeah, so definitely essential. A mixer, I think, is not essential, but could be helpful. Yeah, it's definitely not necessary, but if that's your thing too, for sure, I say might as well experiment if you can, and of course it'll make it sound a little bit better as well live too. So
Cool. Yeah, to add to that answer though, in the third workshop, the Getting Good Tape workshop, will our guest he will talk a little bit more about, the different types of gear, more specific. So if you want to get more nitty-gritty answers, definitely join that workshop. But there's going to be a lot of really awesome information shared by people like Nina. So thank you again, Nina, for this.
no problem.
And
thank you guys for listening.
got a couple minutes if anybody has any final questions. Otherwise, definitely consider joining these next coming workshops too, podcasting and also music production. And we're going to be posting this again, just to be clear, we're going to be posting this on our blog and on YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, or if you want to, find out what something that Nina had mentioned, it'll be on our website. And we have a Discord that we just started too. So I'm just going to add these two links to the chat really quickly on the workshops coming up and also our Discord. Yeah, and just be sure to follow Building Beats on all social media. We're pretty busy, but yeah, if anybody has any other final questions, thank you again, Nina.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Thank you guys for listening. I know I said a lot very quickly, but hopefully it was helpful in some way. And yeah, all of these next workshops can get super in depth in what I kind of touched upon. So I think, yeah, definitely worth checking those out to get more into it, because there's a lot to learn for sure.
Cool, definitely. Yeah, feel free to just hit us up on social or whatever, DM us if you have any questions, etc. Cool. Thank you everybody who tuned in for our first workshop, New York Music Month. Thank you again, Nina. Building Beats team.
Thank you. Thank you.
Otherwise, I think that's about it. Have a good night, everybody, and we'll see you at the next workshop, hopefully.